The water in Ocracoke Inlet is unnaturally still. A pale, pre-dawn light bleeds across the sky, but the marsh grass remains black. The only sound is the gentle lap of waves against wood, and the low, desperate breathing of men. Aboard a small, battered sloop, Lieutenant Robert Maynard wipes sweat from his brow. It is cold, November 1718, but he is sweating. He checks his pistol for the third time. His eyes are fixed on the silhouette anchored a few hundred yards ahead. It is not a large ship, but it seems to suck the remaining darkness into its form. The Adventure. And aboard her, a living nightmare. Suddenly, a voice cuts through the silence. A roar from the direction of the pirate sloop. It is deep, guttural, a sound that seems to boil the mist. Damnation seize my soul if I give you quarters, or take any from you. The words hang in the salt air. A death sentence. An oath. Following the voice, a figure appears at the rail. Even at this distance, the shape is wrong. Too tall. Too broad. Horns of smoke curl from beneath his hat. Fuses are smouldering in his monstrous beard. Edward Teach. Blackbeard. He raises a bottle. He drinks. And the world erupts. Gunfire. Not the pop of a single pistol, but the deafening, splintering roar of swivel guns loaded with langrage, nails, bits of scrap iron, broken hinges. The air is suddenly thick with shrieking metal. It rips into Maynard's deck. It tears through his men. One moment they are crouched, ready. The next, the deck is a slaughterhouse. The smell of salt air is obliterated by the coppery stench of blood and the acidic bite of spent gunpowder. Men are screaming. Others are silent, their bodies mangled, leaking into the scuppers. Maynard stares, ears ringing. This was his plan, his ambush. And in seconds, it has been turned inside out. He has walked his crew into a meat grinder. He sees the pirate sloop begin to move, cutting through the water, a predator coming to finish the kill. He has one desperate card left to play. A gamble that will either be his legend or his epitaph. To understand the bloody stillness of that November morning, we must go back to the golden age of piracy, a time when the Atlantic was a lawless frontier. The war with Spain had ended, flooding the ports with out-of-work privateers, hard men with knowledge of ships and a taste for plunder. And from this brutal school emerged the most feared graduate of all. Edward Teach was a phantom who chose to become a monster. He was likely a sailor from Bristol, England, but the man vanished, consumed by the legend of Blackbeard. He cultivated his appearance as a weapon of psychological terror. Before a fight, he would weave slow-burning fuses, hemp cords soaked in saltpeter and lime water, into his great black beard and hair. They smoldered, wreathing his head in a sulphurous halo of smoke. In the heat of battle, with his face obscured by this hellish cloud, eyes wild, cutlass in hand, he appeared less a man and more a demon summoned from the deep. His reign was not long, barely 2 years, but its impact was seismic. He commanded a fleet, blockaded Charleston in the most audacious act of piracy the American colonies had ever seen, and amassed a fortune. But the world was changing. The British Empire, its trade routes bleeding gold, had declared war on the pirates. A new breed of man hunted them, not just sailors, but bureaucrats and governors. In Virginia, Governor Alexander Spotswood received a steady stream of terrified reports. Blackbeard was here. Blackbeard was there. Trade was strangled. The monster was not just a thief. He was a challenge to the Crown's very authority. Spotswood's weapon was a pair of naval lieutenants, men on the make, hungry for the promotion and prize money that came with a famous capture. Robert Maynard was one of them. A competent officer, but not a legendary fighter. His mission was simple, insane. Take 2 small, shallow draft sloops, Jane and Ranger, sail into the labyrinthine waterways of North Carolina's Outer Banks, find the most dangerous pirate in history, and bring back his head. Maynard's intelligence was good. Blackbeard was careening his sloop, the Adventure, in the remote but familiar waters of Ocracoke Inlet. He believed he was safe. He had, he thought, an arrangement with the local colonial officials, a wink and a nod of corruption. He was relaxing, perhaps planning his next move, with a crew of just 19 men. He'd sent the rest ashore, dividing plunder, dissolving his fleet. He was, in his mind, semi-retired. It was a fatal miscalculation. As Maynard's sloops beat their way south, Blackbeard received a warning. A local merchant, bribed or threatened, had sent word. The devil was coming. But when told the size of the force, Blackbeard merely laughed. "They are only shoals of fish," he reportedly scoffed. "I shall have them for supper." It was the arrogance of a man who had stared down warships and won. He spent his last night on Earth drinking heavily in the company of a coastal pilot and a skeleton crew. The stage, now drenched in shadow and hubris, was set. Just before dawn on November 22nd, 1718, Maynard made his move. The tide was against him. He ordered his men to take to the oars. They rowed, the only sounds the creak of wood and the dip of blades, the adventure growing larger in the gloom. Then, a shout from the pirate sloop. A challenge. Maynard, playing for time, for position, called back that his was a merchant vessel. It was a thin lie, and Blackbeard saw through it instantly. "Let's jump on board and see who they are," the pirate roared to his men. Maynard, seeing the pirates preparing to board, gave the order that would define the battle. He shouted for his men to go below, to hide. It was a terrifying gamble. He was leaving the deck of the Jane virtually empty, a ghost ship, a trap. He needed to negate Blackbeard's opening volley. He needed the pirates to come to him. On the adventure, Blackbeard saw the decks clear. He grinned through his smoking beard. The fight was already over. He gave the order to fire his great guns. The swivels, loaded to the muzzle with murderous scrap, thundered. The blast swept the Ranger, Maynard's other sloop, killing her captain and throwing her crew into disarray. She fell out of the fight. Then, Blackbeard turned the guns on the Jane. The carnage was horrific. As the cloud of smoke drifted, Blackbeard peered across the water. The enemy deck was a charnel house, strewn with what appeared to be corpses. No movement. His trap had worked. Now, for the plunder. "They are all knocked on the head but 3 or 4, he bellowed. "Board her and cut them to pieces." The Adventure crashed alongside the Jane. Grapnels flew, biting into wood, binding the two vessels in a deadly embrace. Blackbeard led the charge, a cutlass in one hand, a pistol in the other, his men swarming behind him. They leapt over the bulwarks, onto a deck slick with blood, and found it empty of living souls. Then, from below, a thunderous cry. Maynard's voice. "Fire!" The hatches flew open, not with the slow emergence of wounded men, but with the violent eruption of a contained fury. Maynard's sailors, who had been lying amid the blood of their slain comrades, poured onto the deck. The air, already thick with smoke, now filled with the deafening crash of concentrated musket fire. The world dissolved into close-quarter chaos, a knife fight on a floating platform. And in the center of it all, 2 men, the lieutenant and the pirate. Their eyes met through the hellish gloom. The space between them was a churning mass of hacking blades, screaming men, and gunsmoke. Maynard and Blackbeard, only yards apart, were islands in a storm of violence. The pirate, a giant in the mist, seemed to move with a preternatural calm. He drew a second pistol from his bandolier, aimed not at Maynard, but at a sailor rushing him. The flash, the report, and the man dropped. Blackbeard didn't even watch him fall. Maynard raised his own pistol, the world narrowing to the demonic figure before him. He pulled the trigger. A click. A misfire. The damp air had betrayed him. Blackbeard's lips peeled back in a grin beneath the smoking fuses. He threw the spent pistol at Maynard with a snarl and charged, cutlass swinging in a wide, hissing arc steel met steel. Maynard, a capable swordsman, was immediately on the defensive. Blackbeard's strength was staggering, each blow vibrating up Maynard's arm, numbing his fingers. This was not the elegant fencing of officers. This was brutish, efficient butchery. Around them, the fight turned grotesquely personal. There were no lines, no formations. It was a series of duels to the death on a deck growing slicker with every second. The sound was a nightmarish orchestra, the crunch of breaking bone, the wet tear of steel finding flesh, the guttural cries of men giving and receiving death. A Highlander in Maynard's crew, his name lost to time, saw his commander faltering. He leapt forward, his broadsword aimed at Blackbeard's neck. The pirate, with reflexes honed in 100 brawls, parried the blow and in the same motion opened the man's face from temple to jaw. The Highlander fell, his scream cut short. But the distraction was enough. Maynard slashed, his blade biting deep into Blackbeard's fingers. The pirate roared, more in fury than pain, but his grip on his cutlass faltered. He staggered back, blood sheeting from his hand. He reached for another pistol. Before he could level it, a royal sailor named James Blake lunged from the chaos, bringing a cutlass down on Blackbeard's neck. The blow was not clean, not decisive. It was a brutal hack. Blood, dark and arterial, sprayed across the men nearby. The legend should have ended there. But Edward Teach did not die like ordinary men. He fought on. A second, third, fourth blow rained down on him from the closing circle of Maynard's men. A cut to the face. A stab to the side. He was bleeding from a dozen mortal wounds, yet he still swung his cutlass, his movements becoming slower, more terrible. He was a spectre refusing to fade. He backed towards the rail, towards his own ship, as if he might still escape the mortal coil. Finally, as he was raising his arm for one last, impossible strike, his body gave out. He collapsed onto the blood-soaked deck. The silence that followed was not true silence. It was the ringing in stunned ears, punctuated by the moans of the dying and the heavy, ragged breathing of the survivors. The pirates, seeing their captain fall, their own numbers decimated, threw down their weapons. The fight was over. It had lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Maynard stood, chest heaving, his fine uniform spattered and torn. He looked down at the corpse at his feet. Even in death, Blackbeard was a terrifying sight. The fuses in his beard had burned out, leaving blackened trails. His face was a mask of gore and defiance. To be certain, and to claim the prize, Maynard gave the order. A sailor, his hands trembling not from fear but from spent adrenaline, stepped forward. With a heavy sweep of his cutlass, he severed Blackbeard's head from his body. The sound was distinct. A final, grim punctuation. They hoisted the grisly trophy by its hair, tying it to the bowsprit of the Jane. The body, with its myriad wounds, was kicked over the side into the Ocracoke waters. Legend would later claim it swam 3 times around the sloop before sinking, a final act of supernatural defiance. The cleanup was as brutal as the fight. Of Blackbeard's 19 men, 10 were dead on the deck, 9 were captured, badly wounded. Maynard's losses were catastrophic. 10 of his men lay dead. Another 24 were wounded. The Jane's deck was a testament to the price of victory. They had won. But as they surveyed the carnage, the head dripping from the bowsprit, it felt less like a triumph and more like a survival. The journey back to Virginia was a somber, ghastly parade. The head of Edward Teach remained tied to the bowsprit, a decaying warning to any who would follow his path. When Maynard presented it to Governor Spotswood, the proof was irrefutable. The monster was dead. The remaining captured pirates were swiftly tried and hanged. Their bodies, like their captains, were put on display in public gibbets along the Chesapeake, a lesson written in flesh and bone. But the death of Blackbeard did not end piracy. In some ways, it announced its decline. The golden age was waning. The empires were getting better at hunting. Yet, the legend was only beginning. The man was gone. The myth was now forever. And in the quiet coves of the Outer Banks, and in the taverns from Nassau to London, the whispers started almost immediately. Some said Maynard had cheated, that hiding his men below was a coward's act, not a soldier's. Others argued it was the only sane tactic against such a foe, that matching Blackbeard in brute force was suicide. The debate etched a moral ambiguity around the victory. Was Maynard a hero, or merely the bureaucrat's blunt instrument who got lucky? Then came the stories. the ones that couldn't be fact-checked. That Blackbeard skull, once the flesh was gone, was turned into a drinking cup, silver-plated, and passed around in secret societies. That his headless body, when thrown overboard, was recovered by his loyal crew and given a proper burial with his treasure, a treasure that has never been found. That on quiet nights at Ocracoke, you can still hear the roar of cannon, the clash of steel, and see a phantom sloop wreathed in smoke, searching for its captain's head. Governor Spotswood declared a day of thanksgiving. Bells rang in Williamsburg. Newspapers in London printed triumphant accounts. The head of Edward Teach, a grisly trophy, was mounted on a pike at the entrance to the Hampton River, a place they would call Blackbeard's Point. It stared with empty sockets towards the sea, a warning to all who sailed in. The message from the Crown was clear. This is the fate of those who challenge the order of empire. But victory has a bitter taste. Lieutenant Maynard returned not to universal acclaim, but to a quagmire of bureaucracy and resentment. The prize money for capturing the pirate, the plunder from the adventure, was paltry. Much of Blackbeard's famed treasure was never found, likely dispersed or hidden. The crew of the Ranger, whose captain was killed in the first volley, felt their sacrifice was overlooked. Maynard spent years petitioning the government for his promised reward, his letters growing increasingly desperate. He was a man who had stared into the eyes of a devil and won, only to be defeated by the petty machinery of the state. He would die years later, his name forever tied to that single, brutal morning, his financial struggles a sad footnote to his violent moment of glory. The captured pirates faced a swifter, harder justice. Brought to Williamsburg, their trial was a spectacle. The survivors of the adventure, men with names like Israel Hands, Blackbeard's former quartermaster who had fortuitously been ashore with a wounded leg, now turned evidence for the Crown to save their own necks. The testimony painted a picture of a floating tyranny, of a captain who would shoot a man in the knee just to remind the crew who was in charge, of a man who created his own hell and ruled it absolutely. 13 of the captives were convicted and hanged. Their bodies were suspended in iron cages at prominent points along the waterways, their bones left to bleach and rattle in the wind, a gruesome, permanent reminder. Yet, almost immediately, the hard facts began to blur into legend. The official reports, written by Maynard and his superiors, were dry, emphasizing the righteousness of the action. But the stories that flowed from sailors and tavern keepers were of a different color. They spoke of Blackbeard's superhuman strength, his final stand taking multiple mortal wounds. They whispered that his headless body swam around the sloop, a tale that spoke to a fundamental disbelief that something so monstrous could be killed by ordinary men. The very brutality of his display became proof of his demonic nature. The man, Edward Teach, was being erased. The myth, Blackbeard, was being forged in the furnace of that bloody encounter. And what of the man behind the myth? The historical Edward Teach remains frustratingly opaque. We know fragments. He could read and write, suggesting some education. He was not the mindless brute of legend. His blockade of Charleston was a masterpiece of psychological and economic warfare. He seems to have been canny, strategic, and understood the power of reputation as a weapon. His famed burying of treasure is likely a fiction. Pirates lived fast, spent fast. But the lingering question of his relationship with authorities in North Carolina hints at a more complex figure. Was he trying to retire? Had he cut a deal with corrupt Governor Charles Eden, believing he could fade into a planter's life? If so, his murder was not just an act of piracy suppression, but a political assassination by the rival colony of Virginia. Spotswood had no jurisdiction in North Carolina. His sending of Maynard was an act of aggression, an invasion. This casts the whole battle in a different light, not as a noble strike against evil, but as a ruthless, extra-legal maneuver in a dirty colonial power struggle. The physical legacy of the fight is as elusive as the truth. The waters of Ocracoke Inlet have shifted over centuries. The adventure was likely burned or left to rot. No tangible artifact from the battle itself has ever been conclusively found, save for one thing, a ghost. The spectral sight of a headless figure wandering the beaches of Ocracoke Island, holding a lantern, searching. The local legend says he is looking for his head, so he can finally rest. It is a story told not with fear, but with a strange reverence. An acknowledgement that some men are too large for a simple death to contain them. Modern historians and marine archaeologists continue to sift through the silt and the documents. Every old cannon raised from North Carolina sounds spark speculation. Could this be from the adventure? In 1996, what is believed to be the wreck of Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen's Revenge, was discovered off Beaufort, North Carolina, a stunning find that yielded tens of thousands of artifacts. But the adventure, the sloop of his last stand, remains lost. Perhaps it is fitting. The final act of his life exists now more in the realm of story than substance. The moral questions hang in the air like gunsmoke. Who, in the end, were the villains? The pirate who terrorized the seas, or the empire whose mercantile greed created the conditions for piracy to flourish? Was Blackbeard a unique monster, or merely the most successful product of a monstrous system? Maynard followed his orders, but his use of a deceptive, almost guerrilla tactic sits uneasily with the image of heroic naval combat. He ambushed an ambusher. He won through cunning, not courage. The battle forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. In the fog of war, the line between civilization and savagery is often drawn in blood, and it is never straight. The story of Blackbeard's last stand is not a simple parable of good conquering evil. It is a darker, richer tapestry. It is about the creation of a legend through violence. It is about the ruthless machinery of empire co-opting that violence for its own ends. It is about how history is written by the victors, but how folklore is written by the haunted. 3 centuries later, the silence at Ocracoke Inlet can still feel heavy. The marsh grass whispers. The water slides quietly over the sandbars. If you stand there at dawn, in that same pale light, you can almost feel it. The echo of a roar, the phantom smell of saltpeter and blood, the chilling certainty that some deeds stain a place forever. The battle lasted minutes. The silence has lasted for ages. And so we are left with the image that started it all. A head, mounted on a pole, facing the sea. A warning that became an icon. A testament to the fact that it is easier for the world to make a monster of a man than to understand him, and easier to kill a legend than to ever truly bury it.